If you've ever wanted to animate characters for video, film, or games, you'll understand how important a good character rig can be. This course shows you how to create a skeletal rig from the ground up. We'll start off with creating skeletons, then we'll move on to creating controls to manipulate those skeletons. And those controls include things such as FK and IK switching. And finally, we'll skin our character to our control rig. Hi, I'm George Maestri. If you've ever wanted to animate characters or learn a little bit more about character rigging, let's get started. If you want to follow along with the exercise files that accompany this course, go ahead and download those now and place them on your desktop. Now, the exercise files folder itself is a Maya project, so it has all of the scenes that we use in the course here under the scenes file. And when you first start up Maya for this course, go ahead and do File, Set Project, and then on your desktop, find that exercise files folder and hit Set. Now, once you do that, everything should be aligned and you should be ready to start learning. Before we dive into rigging, let's step back for a second and understand exactly what a rig accomplishes. A rig is essentially a user interface for the animator. It makes the character easy to animate, and the rig itself should be easy to understand, should also be flexible, and should be able to accomplish a wide variety of animation tasks. So this is the rig we'll be creating in this particular course, and it is essentially just a body rig. So each one of these controls is pretty apparent. So if I were to say select this spine, I could rotate the character left and right. I have these controls here for the arm that moves the character up and down, but I also have additional controls. So for example, this control here switches between IK and FK. And notice how the controls change as that switch is enabled. Now, how you design a rig is really kind of up to you. There's a lot of different ways to rig it. It can be a very creative process. This rig is essentially just a body rig. We do not have any facial controls here, but a more complex rig would have more controls. So this is a rig that we use for our character animation courses. And notice how we have all of these controls for the face. So if I were to say move this, I could actually manipulate the face. And each one of these is clearly laid out and labeled so you understand exactly what each control does. So when you start rigging, you want to understand what it is you want to rig, what the animator needs, and then you want your rig to serve the animator's needs. When you start building your own rigs, there are a couple of industry standard rules that you should follow, and these will result in better rigs that are easier to manipulate. Now, the first rule is simply start with a good model. Good geometry is of utmost importance for a rig. Now, any geometry that deforms should have regular edge loops that follow the motion of the character. So in this case, the body has edge loops around the knees that help it to bend the knees. The shoulders are nice and easy to manipulate as well. And if we look at something like the face, the edge loops of the face follow where the muscles will pull that face, so it will deform in a natural manner. Now, in addition to this, you do not want to keyframe geometry or skeletons. So I've got a couple of layers here in my layer editor, so I'm going to turn on the skeleton here. So we've got basically three groups of objects that we use in a rig. We've got the geometry itself. That geometry is deformed by skeletal joints, and those skeletal joints are controlled by our control rig. So if I turn off skeleton and geometry, these are the controls for the character. These are the only things that should be animated. These, in turn, control the position of the skeletal joints. Those skeletal joints will never be animated. And then the skeletal joints deform the geometry. So the only thing that will be animated are the controls. If we look at this in our outliner, you'll see I've also organized the scene the same way. So geometry is a separate group. The skeleton is another separate group, and then the character's controls are here. So when you go to animate the character, everything you need is in this control group. Now, another important thing about controls is that you should always make sure they are aligned properly and zeroed out. So if I were to select, say, the shoulder control, you'll see that all of the values are 0. So if I were to move that in some way and animate my character, I can always get back to my default pose by plugging 0 into translate and rotate. So every control you have should have the rest position as 0. Now, once we understand all of these rules, it makes it much easier to rig a character. Before we actually get down to rigging a character, I want to go through all the major tools that we will be using in the rigging process. I find that understanding these tools a little bit ahead of time helps you to understand the rigging process as we go through it. The first tool we're going to look at is the joint tool. Now we can find this in one of two places. If we go into the rigging menu set, you'll see under skeleton we have create joints. We also have a rigging shelf here, and that also has a create joint tool. So let's go into skeleton, create joints. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the options here, and we have our tool settings. So I'm just going to hit reset just to make sure that we're all in the same place. Now, under joint settings, we have a lot of different things, and these probably won't make sense to you until you start using them. But probably the most important one is the orientation settings. So here we have what's called a primary axis. Now, by default, this is the x-axis, and that means that the joint is going to be pointed down the x-axis. And this can be important depending upon how you want to rig your characters. And so we're just going to go with the default here of x, but I'll show you a little bit more about this as we go through it. So I'm going to go ahead and close this, and I've already selected this tool, so you can see that my cursor has changed. So I'm going to go out to a 4 view, and let's go ahead and hit spacebar over our side view. Now I'm drawing this in an orthographic view just to make sure that the joint chain is flat. So I'm going to left click on this, and that will give me a joint. If I left click again, that gives me a second joint. Now the joints are these circular objects, and in between is this kind of tetrahedral shape, and typically that's referred to as a bone, but basically it just shows you that these two joints are connected. So if I click again, you can see that I'm getting something that looks kind of like a knee and an ankle, and then maybe click again to get the toe. So we have, say, a hip, knee, ankle, and toe. Now, once you're done with your joint creation, all you have to do is hit enter, and then we can go to select mode and hop out to a perspective view. So as you can see, we've got these joints. Now, if we go into the outliner, you'll see that the joints are connected hierarchically. So the first one I drew is obviously joint 1, joint 2 is our knee, 3, and 4. Now, when we drew these joints, remember that we drew them so that they were aligned along the x-axis. So if I select one of these joints and go into my move tool and double click on it and go into, say, object orientation, you will see that the object itself, the joint, is aligned along the x-axis. So in other words, this joint's x-axis is pointed towards the next joint in the chain. So my hip is pointed at my knee, the knee is pointed along x at the ankle, and so on. Now, the toe itself is not aligned, and that's because each one of these is aligned to the next joint. And in this case, there is no next joint. So this one is just aligned to the x-axis of the world. And I'm going to show you how to change that in just a second. Now, when you draw these chains, there are many times when you'll need to adjust those joints. So, for example, this one, maybe I drew that a little bit low, or let's say the knee was a little bit off. So I can basically adjust these however I want and just, basically reposition this chain very fluidly. Now, when you start to do this, you're going to run into a problem. So if I select this joint here, you'll see that by moving this knee, I did not move the axis of the hip joint. So in other words, the hip is no longer pointed at the knee. And so when I go to rotate this joint, it's not going to be aligned properly. And the same goes for the knee. You can see how that's kind of a little bit off from pointing at the ankle. So when you start to draw chains into a character, you'll be doing things like, adjusting these joints just so they're exactly positioned right. And that's going to throw off your orientation of your joints. Now we can fix this very simply by going into Skeleton, Orient Joint. And let's go into the options here. So orient joints really works very simply. If I select the top of the hierarchy, it will work its way down the hierarchy and align them to whatever I want. So if I select my primary axis as X, make sure I orient the children of the selected joints, and make sure that we have orient joint to world toggled off. Let's go ahead and hit apply. Now watch what happens to this. It gets reoriented. So now my X is again pointing at the next joint. But we still have the problem with this end joint. And in this case, it's the toe. But we want this to still be kind of in line with everything else. Well, we can fix that very easily by going orient joint to world and hitting apply. And what that does is it just flips it around so that it actually orients to parent. Now, I don't know why they called it orient joint to world. It really should be orient joint to parent. But it still works. Now, there are times when you may want to orient things a little bit differently. Let's say you don't want this along the x-axis. Maybe you want it along the y-axis. Well, you can certainly do that. And certain game engines such as Unreal prefer to have the joints oriented this way. So it really just depends on the project and the client that you're working for. But you always can hit apply and align them this way as well. So as you can see, drawing joints is fairly easy. But when you adjust your joints, you want to make sure that you reorient them to themselves as well as the world. When you work with joints in a character, you'll be using a lot of rotation. So understanding how Maya calculates rotation can be very important to getting the rig working the way that you want. So let's take a look under the hood of Maya and see how we can change what's called rotation order. Now here I have a simple joint, and if I double click on this, we can go into, say, world mode, and we can rotate around the world axis. We can go into object mode, which rotates around object axis, and we can basically rotate however we want. But in this case, I'm going to go into what's called gimbal mode. Now, what this does is it forces you to rotate along specific axes. So in this case, I can't rotate around X and Y or X, Y, and Z. I can only rotate around individual axes. So in this case, I can rotate around Z or Y or so on. Now, when I do this, you're going to notice something a little strange. So if I rotate around the Z axis, you'll see that all the other axes go with it, and that's kind of what we expect. But if I select the y-axis, notice how the x-axis goes with it, but not the z-axis. And we can get to a point here where the z and x-axis almost overlap. And when this happens, this can create a little bit of a problem because of the way Maya calculates rotation. And we can get what's called gimbal lock, and we can get what are called joint flips. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. And let's go into the attribute editor. Now, under this joint, under transform attributes, you'll see we have what's called rotate order. Now, this tells Maya what order to rotate the joints. So as you're noticing here that if I rotate Y, Z is not going with it. And this is basically what's called XYZ rotation. So Z here is dominant. So it's the one that's last to calculate. Now, if I want to, I can change this. I can change this really to almost any orientation I want. Now, the orientation that you choose is really going to depend upon the character, how the joints are oriented, where the particular joints are in the character. So there's no hard and fast rule for how to set these. But you need to understand that this does exist and that you can change it if you're getting problems with joint rotation. So in this case, I have right now X, Y, and Z, but if I wanted to, I could say reverse it, Z, Y, X. So in this case, now Z goes this way. And so you can see that as I rotate around X and Y, now in this case, Z is following Y rather than the opposite way, which was when I do X, Y, Z, you can see that now X is following. So in this case, this is a hip of a character. So typically, the character is going to walk this way. It's going to rotate around, say, the Z axis. It may move its leg out left and right, but this joint really doesn't twist along that x-axis. So in this case, the non-twisting joint makes it so that we kind of want x to be that last one calculated. So in this case, xyz works. But in a different part of the character, a different rotation order might be needed. So just understand that this feature exists, and it can get you out of some situations where things aren't rotating the way that you want. When we create a rig for character animation, we want a control structure that modifies the underlying joints. So typically, the animator will only touch controls, and those controls in turn will manipulate the joints that deform the character. Now, there are a number of ways to connect our controls to our joints. And one of the most popular ways is called a constraint. So let's go through some of the most popular constraints and see how they work. Now, this scene is pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. If you look at it in the outliner, you see we have all of these joints and these control objects, and this joint is down here. So I'm just going to middle click and move it up just so we have all of these organized. Now, if I were to select one of these controls, you can see that at this point it's zeroed out. And that's what we want with a control. We want our control's default position to always be 0. That makes it very easy to reset the rig. Now, we can do this with regular objects or curves. All we have to do is select the object, and let's say we accidentally moved it or something and we got some numbers in there. All we have to do is just do a modify freeze transformations, and that will zero everything out. And that's pretty easy, and you're probably already aware of that. Now, with joints, however, we can't do that. So if I were to say move this joint around and do a modify freeze transformations, nothing happens, right? And if I were to say zero this out manually, it goes to the origin. So the actual world position of the object is baked into a joint. So I'm going to go ahead and undo my way out of this. So if we want to control this and have the ability to have a good 0 point, we will need to connect these with something like a constraint. So let's go ahead and see how constraints work. So I'm going to be in my rigging menu, and under constraint, let's go ahead and tear off that menu. Now, there's a whole bunch of constraints that Maya can use, but the ones we're going to use in character rigging are pretty much the ones along the top here. So let's go ahead and constrain this joint to this control. So I'm going to select the control first, select the joint last, and then let's do what's called a parent constraint. Now, if I click on the options, you'll see we have options to control what exactly is constrained, but the most important checkbox in this menu is this maintain offset. If I check it off and hit apply, that joint will basically align itself with the control and put itself kind of off kilter or whatever you want to call it. So if I undo that and check maintain offset, it will go ahead and just leave this in place and create the constraint. Now, if we look at the constraint, you'll see it's here in the outliner, and the constraint is on the joint. So here we have joint A parent constraint. Now, the parent constraint acts as if it is in a hierarchy with the control. So if I were to say rotate this or move it, that joint just follows along. And it's essentially attached to that control without actually being in a hierarchy. And that's one of the great things you can do with rigging. Now we have this control already zeroed out, so if I want to just put it back to normal, I just select all of these values and hit 0, and it goes back to normal. Now we have a bunch of other constraints as well, so I'm going to pull up my constraint menu here. We have what's called a point constraint, and that just constrains position. So if I look at this, make sure I have maintain offset on. I'm going to select my controller and then the joint and click add. And so what this does is it constrains the motion. So if I move this or translate it, the joint follows. But if I were to rotate this, nothing happens to the joint. It's only following translation. Now we have another constraint for orientation. So if I pick these and do orient, make sure I have maintain offset on. Now the rotation of the joint will follow the rotation of the control. Now notice how the joint is rotating around its own center. So whatever number comes up in this rotate field will actually just be put into the joint's rotation, and it will rotate around its pivot. Now, another popular one is what's called the aim constraint. So if I were to select my control and then select the joint and just do an aim constraint, you'll see that this really flips around. And what it does is it points the joint at the object. So the orientation of that joint does matter. And in this case, it's pointing down X, and X is pointing at this object. And this is great for a number of things that we can do in character animation, including controlling the eyes. Now, in addition to constraining one object to another, we can also do it with multiple objects. So let's go ahead and take, say, this joint here, and I can constrain it to be between two controls. So if I select this control here and just do an edit, duplicate, I now have two controls. So if I shift select both of these and then select the joint last, and let's just do a point constraint, this object will stay between each one of these. If I select the joint, you'll see that down here I have a point constraint. I also have that in the attribute editor here. But if we go to the channel box, you can see that if I select this, this control E1 is basically both of these are at 1. If I animate that to 0, it goes to one side. If I bring that back up to 1 and animate the other one to 0, it goes to the other side. Now, this can be used a lot for switching between different control structures in your rig. So if you wanted to switch between IK and FK, this basically is the key to doing that. So as you can see, controls can manipulate joints using constraints. And depending upon what you want to do with your character, you can use different types of constraints. Another way to get your controls to manipulate the rig is to use direct connections. Now, this avoids constraints, and it's actually a simpler and more direct method, but there are some limitations. So let's take a look at this. I have this joint in a scene and then this control. Now, if I want to, I can select both of them and go into Windows, General Editors, Connection Editor. Now, in this case, my control loaded up on the left and the joint loaded up on the right. So I want my control to manipulate my joint. So I want to press this from and to button so that it's going from the control to the joint. Now I can scroll down and actually select whatever value I want to control. So in this case, let's say rotate. So if I select rotate on this side and scroll down so I get rotate on the other side, now I have a connection. So if I were to rotate this, the joint goes the same way. Now, I don't need to do all of these. I can certainly just do something like, say, rotate Y to rotate Y, and then only Y will work and nothing else will work. And this is just a great way to connect things. Now, I'm going to click off on these and turn them off. And then let's just go ahead and shift select these again. Now I find the easier way to do this is use what's called the node editor. So if we go into Windows, node editor, it brings up this window. So I'm actually going to position my stuff over here. And let's go ahead and select this joint and then move it. And I'm going to hold down the letter V, and that will snap to a vertice. So I'm just going to snap this directly to that joint. Now, when you use the node editor, you can load any number of objects or nodes into it and then connect them all together. So I'm going to start from scratch here and just go ahead and hit this button, which clears it out. And then I'm going to select my joint and my control and then hit this plus sign. And that brings in all of these objects. Now, if we zoom in, you'll see we've got actually 3 nodes here. We've got the joint, which is this. And notice how when I select it in the node editor, it actually selects the object. I've got the control. Now, this is the actual position node of the control. And then down here, I have what's called the shape node. Now, we're not going to be working with that because we really want to work with connecting things such as translation and rotation. So in this case, you'll notice that we have a translate and a rotate for both of these. So if I want to, I can draw a line from here to here. So I'm just left clicking and dragging and connecting rotate to rotate. And when I do that, you'll see that, again, all of the rotations are matching. And I'm doing this without a constraint. Now, I don't have to do just rotate. I could also do, say, translate. So if I select translate here, now the translation of this is feeding into that as well. If I were to break this, I could select that control and move it off. And if I were to move it off and then reconnect it, notice how that jumps. And this actually brings up a very good point with this, and that is that these numbers in this control are directly going into the joint. So remember, the joint itself, you can't zero out the position. So in order for this to work, this particular controller does have to have the same numbers in it. Now, this isn't ideal for a rig, but I'm going to show you some tricks for actually getting around this little deficit. But the most important thing you need to know is that the node editor itself is a very, very handy way to connect all sorts of different things within Maya. And we're going to be using this a lot as we rig our character. When we create controls for our rigs, we want the controls to default to 0 values, and that makes it easy to reset. So sometimes that's not as easy as it sounds. And in order to get things to 0, sometimes we have to add in additional nodes called offset nodes. So let's take a look at how this works. I have this joint, and if I want to control it, I want to create a controller that is aligned with this joint. And that means the axes are aligned. So in this case, the red axis or the x-axis is pointing down the joint. So I need to create a controller along the x-axis. In my scene, the x-axis is going down the side view. So it's perpendicular or parallel to the side view. So I can just go ahead and create a NURB circle or curve, whatever you want, in that side view. And now it's aligned to X. So in other words, the X axis is pointing along that curve. Now I could certainly create this in other ways and still get this aligned, but I find just drawing it in the side view is the easiest. Now I want this to be aligned to my joint. So the easiest way to do that is to simply use a parent constraint. So I need to select my joint first, select my control second, because what I'm going to do is be modifying the control to match the joint. And we're going to do this using a parent constraint. So if I select constrain parent, and I want to make sure that in this case, maintain offset is off. And when I hit apply, watch what happens. That snaps to the joint and is perfectly aligned. So if I select that control and go into Windows Outliner, you'll see that I've got this parent constraint. Now, once this is aligned, I can just select the constraint and delete it. And if I select my NURB circle, you'll see that I have a whole bunch of numbers, which I tend to refer to as garbage numbers. And those are the exact translation and rotation values of the joint. So if I were to select the joint, you'll see these numbers here match the ones on my NURB circle. Now I'm going to go ahead and select this NURB circle. Let's go ahead and change the name to Control A. Now the big problem with this is that I want these numbers here in my control to be 0. Now, your first instinct is like, oh, well, that's easy. All I have to do is modify freeze transformations. But when I do that, watch what happens to the orientation of the axis. So this changes. So now the red axis or the x-axis is not pointing in the same direction as the joint. And that's just not going to work. We want this to be aligned properly. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. And we have to find a way to get this number here into something else. And we can do that by creating what's called an offset node. Now, an offset node is essentially a group. You just group the object to itself and find a way to get these numbers into that group so you can zero out the control. So all I'm going to do is select my control, go Edit, Group, or hit Control G. And that creates a group and makes the controller a child of that group. So I'm going to select group 1. Let's double click on it and let's call it offset A. Now I want this to be aligned with the circle. Well, we can do that easily by going modify, center pivot. Now when I center pivot, it still keeps this at 0. So if I select my offset, I've got all the zeros that I want, but I still have these garbage numbers in the controller. So I need to move these from here in the controller to the offset. Now, there's a couple of ways to do that. I can literally just retype the numbers, but that's kind of a hack. So let's try something else. So I'm going to select my joint, shift select the offset, and let's just do another parent constraint. And again, maintain offset is off. So now my offset has all of those numbers in it. And my circle, well, my circle still has those numbers. But if I, for example, zero out the rotations, now it's aligned. But I still have translation here, but I can just do a modify freeze transformations on the control, and everything is now at 0. Now I can select that offset parent constraint and delete it, and now all of these garbage numbers are in the offset, and my control is at 0. So now if I select my control, shift select my joint, I can do a constrain, point constraint, maybe a constrain orient constraint, and now this will move and rotate with that control, but the offset that I need is in this kind of dummy node, this offset node. And so this is a great way to zero out your controllers. And this method has been used a lot in character animation and rigging with Maya. So in order to zero out your controller, you may need to create an offset node that contains the garbage numbers for the controller. Now, we just took a look at how offset nodes can be used to create controllers that can zero out. And if you recall, if we go into the outliner here, you can see that here we have this controller with an offset node. Now, the controller itself is all 0 values. But if we go to the offset node, you'll see that we have all of the garbage numbers that we needed to put into it in order to get this to zero out. Now, this method of creating offset nodes is pretty standard in most Maya rigs. Now, that is changing with the advent of Maya 2020. Maya 2020 has a new feature which basically eliminates the need for offset nodes, and it's going to make your rigs much cleaner. And this feature is called an offset parent matrix. Now that's a kind of a mouthful, but let me just show you what we have here. So here I have a second control and a second joint. So I'm going to go ahead and move this control and hold down the letter V to snap to points here. And I'm just going to align this with my joint. Now you'll notice that this control here, control B, we have a similar situation. We have all of these garbage numbers. And if I were to do something like a modify freeze transformations, that's not going to work because the axes will change. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. Now we can get the same effect as an offset node using what's called a parent matrix. Now, what is a parent matrix? Well, it's simply another set of transforms that are in every object in Maya. So if I select my control, go into my attribute editor, and select my leftmost tab here, which is my main shape, you'll see that I have transform attributes. Now, these are the same attributes here that we have in our channel box. But if I scroll down in that attribute editor, you'll see we have another rollout called Transform Offset Parent Matrix. And what this is essentially the same thing. So we have translate, rotate, scale. We also have the same here, translate, rotate, and scale. So I have a second set of transforms that I can use to place those garbage numbers. Now, the easiest way to do this is to simply just copy the numbers from here down to here. So, for example, I could copy this X value down to here. And of course, that moves it. But when I zero out that X value, it snaps back. So now this 4.323 is in my translation on the offset rather than the main attributes. And if I go to my channel box, you'll see that that one is zeroed out. Now, I could certainly get really tedious and just kind of copy all the numbers over, but that's, again, very tedious. So I'm actually going to undo this. And let me show you a little trick for getting all of these numbers into here. And we can do it in the node editor. So I'm going to select my object, go Windows, Node Editor, and then just hit plus to load it in. Now I'm going to go ahead and move the shape node out of the way and expand this node. Now, this node has a bunch of stuff here, and the one we're looking for is matrix. Now, matrix is essentially what's in the channel box. It's all of your translation, rotation, and scale. So I'm going to select that, and I'm going to plug that into here. And essentially, I'm feeding a number from the object's translation back into itself. And we're going to select Other. And then I'm just going to scroll down until I find Offset Parent Matrix. Now, when I do this, my control jumps way out of the scene here. But if we look at the attribute editor, you'll see that all of these values are now placed into the offset parent matrix. Now, I don't want to touch this and I don't want to move this because this is a live connection. So if I were to change any of this, it would start to feed back on itself and you wouldn't like the results. But I can select that connection immediately after creating it and just hit delete. And when I do, if I select my object, you'll see that now I have those numbers in both of them. Well, that's easy to fix here. All I have to do is go to my channel box, select these numbers, and zero them out. And what that does is it zeroes out that object, but it's still a little bit off, but I can certainly move it. So if I move it and make sure I have snap to points here, snap it there, my axes are aligned, my rotations are zero. All I have to do is do a modify, freeze transformations. Everything is zero. Now, the net result of this is that all of those values are now in my offset parent matrix. So now I can connect the objects using constraints or direct connections, the node editor, whatever, and anything in my channel box is now set to zero. So instead of having an offset node containing these, it's simply in the offset parent matrix. So when you rig in Maya 2020 and beyond, offset parent matrices are the best way to go for creating offsets. Now let's get down to actually rigging the character. Now the character that we're going to use is this little guy, and his name is Gary. And when we get a model for rigging, there are a couple of things that we want to do just to make sure that the rigging process goes smoothly. Now, you may get a model that is off-center or something like that. And the first thing you want to do is just to get this model or the geometry aligned with the world. We want the symmetrical model to be on the 0 plane. So if I hop out to, say, a front view, I just want to zoom in and just make sure that the vertical axis, the y-axis, is centered along that character. Now, this character is pretty easy because he has a very nice edge loop that goes along his center. And just as long as that is lined up with the y-axis, we should be good. Now, on the other axis, looking down the x-axis in the side view, again, you pretty much want him centered. So I have his leg kind of centered along the y-axis as well. Now, it's not that important to have this perfect on the front back axis or this looking at it from the side view, but it does help. Now, when we get geometry, it may have been modeled or something like that. So we want to make sure that we get rid of all history in the model. So I'm going to select all of the objects in the scene and then just go modify, freeze transformations. And that basically zeroes everything out. If we take a look at one of the models here and say do a move tool, you can see that also the pivots are centered. So if not, you may want to do a modify center pivot. Now, this particular character comes in a number of different pieces. So if we go into the outliner, you can see that I've already grouped the geometry. Now, this is under a group called geometry, and then each one of these objects is part of that geometry. Now, the scene also has some lights in it, and again, those are grouped. And this will just help me to view the scene as I rig and work with the character. Now, once we have this, we should start setting up layers. Now, for this particular scene, we need a layer for the geometry. We need a layer for the skeleton, which deforms the mesh, as well as layers for our controls and other utility nodes. So let's go ahead and go into the outliner, and I'm going to select all of my geometry, and then let's do create layer from selected. And I'm going to double click on that, and we'll call this layer geometry. Hit save. So now I can template that if I need to, so that way I don't accidentally select it. Now we can do the same for the lights. And I'm just going to create a layer from selected, and we'll double click on that, and we'll just call it, let's call it lights. And I'm going to go ahead and move that down towards the bottom. Now I'm going to go ahead and move that towards the bottom, and I will template that so that way I don't accidentally select the lights in the scene. Now, in addition to this, we are going to need layers for other parts of the scene. So I'm going to create some empty layers that we will fill up later. So I'm going to create an empty layer here, double click on it, and we're going to call this one Skell. Now, this is going to be for the skeleton of the character that deforms the geometry. Create another one, double click on it, and we will call this one Util. Now that's for utility nodes or nodes that are not actual controls, but secondary nodes that help to make the rig work. And then finally, another layer, and this will be for controls. So CTRLS. So say these are the actual controls that we will use to animate the character. Now, once you have all of this in place, you should be ready to start rigging the character and drawing the skeleton. With our character set up, we can now start to draw the skeleton of the character. Now, this will deform the geometry of the character, so you need to pay attention to anatomy and draw your joints anatomically. They need to line up with the hips and the knees and so on. Now, we're going to work on the lower part of the character. We're going to do the legs and the feet. So let's go ahead and go into skeleton, create joints, and I just want to make sure I reset my joint tool. And then I'm going to hop over to a side view. And let's go ahead and turn on a wireframe so we can see what we're doing here. And then I want to make sure that I have my joint tool selected. So I'm doing this from the shelf. You can certainly do it from the menu. So the first joint is going to be the hip. Now you want to make sure that you place this anatomically. Where is the pelvis attached to the upper part of the leg? And so it's going to be somewhere around the center of this circular mass here. So I'm going to place it right around here. And then we're going to go down to the knee. Now, I don't want to draw this exactly straight down. I do want to make that knee a little bit forward, and that will help IK create the solution. And then these edge loops here will also help to guide us. So I want to place it right at the center of that edge loop. And then the ankle, I'm going to try and center that as well, maybe a little bit back from the knee. And then we need to do the ball of the foot and the toe. Now, I want these to be pretty much on the ground here. So I'm going to go as close to the floor as possible for this. And then a toe, hit enter. That should be pretty close. And then I need to do one more for the heel. So I want to make sure I have my joint tool selected. I'm going to click on the ankle and then add in another joint right here. So now if I go into perspective here, and let's go ahead and turn on X-ray joints. So I've got this joint chain, but because we drew it in an orthographic view, it does show up at the center, but we can move that. In fact, I'm going to do this in my front view here so I can see this a little bit more clearly. And again, I want to turn on wireframe. So I'm just going to move this a little bit to the left, and this will become the left side of the character here. So I want to make sure that this knee is centered. That's going to be the most important part of this. Now, the foot is a little bit to the right of this joint, but that should be okay. And then the hip is pretty much in place from where we want it. So now that I have this, I need to organize my scene. So I'm going to go into my outliner and just expand all of this. So I've got all of my joints, but they need to be named. So this is where we decide what our naming scheme is going to be. In this case, I'm going to use the prefix SKEL for skeleton, and then the name of the joint. In this case, hip left. And then I'm going to copy that prefix, go down to the next joint, which is the knee left. Paste it, ankle, left. That's the ball of the foot. And that's the toe. And then that's the heel. So now I've got my joint chain. Now, this is just one side of this, so we do need to do the opposite side as well. So all we have to do for that is to just copy this whole joint chain and then just move it over to the opposite side. So you can see that this one in Translate X is 1.8999, okay? And so all we have to do is flip that number around and it should go to the opposite side. So I'm going to select all of these joints, hit Control D for duplicate, and you'll see we get a whole second joint chain. And what we want to do is put that on the negative side. So instead of 1.8, negative 1.8. And there we go. So now that's flipped over to the other side. But the naming is off. So I'm going to just select all of these, and we're going to go Modify, Search, and Replace Names. So I'm going to search for _L for left and replace it with _R for right. Hit apply. Let's change them all. This one's got an extra little character there. So there we go. So now I have these joints for my legs. Now, as you start to build this, you do want to stay organized. So I'm going to go over to my layers, select Scale, right click, and do Add Selected Object. So now those joints are part of that layer, and I'm just really just keeping things organized. So now that you have this done, you can move on to other parts of the character. Now let's continue working with our skeletal joints, and we're going to work our way up the character, and so we're going to draw the spine. Now again, we're going to do this in a side view. So I'm going to hop over to my side view. And so what we want is we want basically a spine that follows the back of the character. Now, anatomically, the spine is the backbone. So it is along the backside of that character. And if you want anatomically correct deformations, you are going to have to draw your spine towards the back. So I'm going to follow these edge loops here as my guide. So all I have to do is select the joint, and then I'm going to draw one just below that belt line right there. And then about every 3 edge loops or so. So one there, one there, one there. And maybe one more right around here is kind of right around where the shoulders are. So now that I've got these, you can see that they're automatically centered to the character. And so I don't really have to do much with these. So all I have to do now is just go in and rename them in the outliner. Now this is joint 1, 2, 3. A simple renaming scheme would be just to search and replace names and search joint and replace it with skell underscore spine and hit replace. So that way it keeps all of these numbers and goes skell spine 1, 2, 3, and 4. So now I have my spine in place. Now, once we have this in place, we also should add it to our layers here. So add selected objects, and there we go. Now, when you create skeletal joints, you do have to pay attention to deformation. These are the joints that will deform the character. Now, one of the things that is typically a problem is that this spine is along the back. So it makes it really hard for these joints to control the front part of the character. Because they're centered, also the sides of the character might not deform properly. Now we can help that by creating what I would call ribs. In other words, additional joints that will be used in the deformation. So let me show you how to do this. I'm going to go into my front view here. And I'm just going to create one joint. So I'm going to select my joint tool here and just create a lone joint and hit enter. So I'm going to call that joint skell underscore rib left 01. So that's just a joint. So I'm going to duplicate that again and move it to the other side. And we're going to call that rib right 01. And then I'm going to duplicate that one more time, Control D, center it, and then hop over to my side view and position that right at the belly button. And this is going to be C01 for center. So now I've got these 3 joints. And if we look at them in the outliner, you'll see that these are kind of just hanging out here. They're not attached to anything. Now, if I want, I can middle click and drag them over spine 1. And I'm going to go into a perspective view so you can see what happens when I do that. So middle click, drag over spine 1, and it connects those. So now when spine 1 rotates, these rotate with it, and they will drag the geometry closest to them with them as well. And so this is a great way to create additional controls that will make your deformations and your skinning a lot easier. So I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate these. And notice how they duplicate with the proper number here, 02. And then I'm just going to middle click and drag them above spine 2 and then select them all and move them vertically. So now I've got ribs for the next level. Duplicate those again. Make sure I select them all for spine 3. And again, move them up. And let's do one more. Duplicate, Control D, and go spine 4. Select them all and move them up. So what I've done here is essentially created some additional joints that can help to deform that character. So I can move these out a little bit just to position them exactly the way that I want. And now when my main skeleton deforms, hopefully it will pull that geometry along a lot easier when I go to skin the character. Now let's move on to the character's arms. Now, this particular character is symmetrical, like most, so we can actually use a feature called symmetry to help us draw the arms and make sure that they are perfectly symmetrical. So we're going to do this in probably a front viewport. So I'm going to hop over to a front viewport. And we want to draw basically the clavicle, the shoulder, elbow, and the wrist. Now, before we do this, we do need to set up our Create Joint tool. So I'm going to go into Skeleton Create Joint and select my tool settings. And I've got this at default. And so the one thing that I want to change here is symmetry. If I turn on symmetry, it will draw exactly opposite of the center line with another joint. So in other words, if I do x-axis and I start drawing, notice how that creates those joints that are exactly opposite. And that's a great way to draw my opposite side of my character. So I'm going to go ahead and position this left arm. And then I'm going to draw one here for the for the clavicle, another one almost directly above the armpit. So right in between these two edge loops is probably a good place to do it and keep it fairly centered. Another one for the elbow. And again, we want to center that. And then the wrist. So now that I have that in place, look what we got. We've got that exact same thing on the opposite side. Now, one of the nice things is that this is still symmetrical, so it is connected. So if we want to look at this in the outliner, you'll see that this joint here is mirrored on the other side, and each one of these joints on the other side has what's called a symmetry constraint. And that's great when you're positioning the bones and aligning things exactly the way that you want. But once you're done with it, you will have to delete these. And we'll go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and select this left arm chain. And let's go into a top view and see what we have. Well, it drew it at the origin, which is pretty much what we expected. So let's go ahead and move that back a little bit. So that way it's centered here. Now, my wrist is a little bit off, and I want my elbow to be a little bit back because we are going to use some IK on this. So I am going to reposition some of these. So I'm going to go ahead and move that a little bit forward, this one a little bit back, and I just want a slight bend in this, and that'll make it a little bit easier to set up IK. And this one should be centered to that wrist. And then the other ones look pretty good. Now, again, remember we did change the orientation of our joints. So I'm going to go ahead and select those and go skeleton orient joints. And I want to make sure that I orient those. Select the end joint, skeleton, orient joint. And for the end effector, I want to orient joint to world. So go ahead and hit apply, orient that. And hopefully that should be the same on the opposite side. So now we've got everything lined up. So now that I have all of this, I can go into my outliner and go into that second set of joints and delete those symmetry constraints. So I'm just going to go ahead and control select those and delete them. And once they're deleted, that connection is no longer active, okay? So now that we've got these in place, all we have to do is rename them and then move on to other parts of the rig. With the arms in place, we can now move on to the hands. Now, the hands are kind of complex because the fingers have a lot of joints. And so I'm going to show you a quick technique to make this a little bit simpler. So As we've seen before, we can draw with symmetry, and we can do that with the hands as well. But there's another feature we can use to help make sure that everything is aligned properly. Now, typically, if I were to, say, draw a skeleton for a hand, I could go into skeleton, create joints, and let's just go ahead and reset our tool. So at the default, if I were to, say, draw this index finger, you can see it, well, yeah, it's aligned right there. But if I hop out to, say, a perspective view, well, where is it? Well, it drew at the origin, which is what it was supposed to do. And so that's kind of annoying. And then it also drew flat. Now, not all of these fingers in this particular model have been drawn flat. And so it's going to be a real chore to get these actually aligned exactly the way that we want. But there is another feature that we can use to help us with this. And so we can find it under Create Joints. If we go into Tool Settings here, let's go ahead and turn on Symmetry so we can draw the opposite hand. And then the feature that we're looking for is called Projected Centering. Now, what this will do is draw the joint at the center of the geometry. So if I'm drawing here, we'll draw it along the center of the finger. So let's go ahead and keep Symmetry on and Projected Centering on. So when I do that, I'm going to go ahead and be a little more careful this time. I'm going to draw my knuckle. This is the first joint, second joint, and then one just outside of the end of the finger. Hit Enter, and there it is. Look at that. That is so much easier and so much better. So we also drew it with symmetry, so this finger is pretty much identical. So this is awesome. So we can continue to do this for all of the fingers. So all I have to do is just draw all of these, name everything, and we should be good to go. Now, the other problem here is with the thumb. Now, the thumb is going to be a little bit different. So let me show you how to draw the thumb. So I'm going to go ahead and select my joint tool. And again, I already have projected centering on. So until I turn it off, it's always going to be on. So for this thumb, I want to draw my first joint somewhere around here. Draw another joint here, and then that last joint right outside the edge. Now, when I do that, projected centering isn't exactly perfect, but it's actually pretty close right now. So if I were to look at this in object mode, you want to make sure that you've got your joints aligned properly. So in this case, this joint is aligned so that that thumb will bend that way. And so you want to make sure that this joint has that alignment. Now, this last joint here is not aligned. So again, we can do an orient joint. Make sure we have orient to world and hit apply. And we can do the same for that as well. So now, once I have my thumb and my index finger, I can use the same process to do the other fingers as well. Once all of your joints are in place, you will need to finalize your skeleton. Now, I've gone ahead and added in a couple of extra joints here, and these are in the head. Now, we're going to save facial and head rigging for another course, but in order to be able to skin this character properly, I will need a very basic skeleton. So I've created this joint chain here just for the neck and the head. Now, once your skeleton is in place, you want to make sure that you add all of those joints to your skeleton layer. So if you turn that on or off, all of those joints should go away. Now, if we go into the outliner, you'll see that we have all of these drawn as separate chains. Now, because all these joints will do is to form geometry, it is not absolutely imperative that they are in the same hierarchy. It will depend on how you rig them as to whether or not you want them to be that way. Now, I do want my hands and my wrists to be connected, and so that's going to be fairly easy to do. So I've got my index and all of my fingers here on my left hand. So if I go into my arm skeleton here, you'll see I have my wrist. So all I have to do is middle click and drag those above the wrist, and they're connected as a hand. Open up the right side, select all of these. So index through pinky. And again, middle click and drag to put those in place. And as you can see, it draws the connections there. Now, the rest of these I may or may not want to connect in to the rest of the skeletons. So I can leave that for later. But one of the things I do want to do is group those skeletal joints. So I'm going to select them all, do Edit Group or Control G, double click on that group and just call it skeleton. So now I've got the skeleton as a group. Everything is organized. And I also have it as a layer. So it's pretty organized and easy to control. So now that I've got all of my skeletal joints in place, I can start to build my rig. With our skeleton in place, we can now move on to actually rigging our character. Now, when we rig, we add controls to be able to move that skeleton around. Now, I'm going to start with the legs and the feet, and we're going to create an IK rig that will allow you to position the feet simply by moving them. Now, in order to do that, I will need some controls. So I have some objects here in the scene, and these are basically going to be the basis of my controls. Now, I simply took a NURB circle and I deformed it a bit to create these shapes. And so this will be the main foot, this will be kind of the toe control, and this will be the heel lift control. So with these three controls, we should be able to position the foot pretty easily. So the first thing you want to do is select these, and let's go ahead and see what they look like in the outliner. So like I said, I created these from NURB circles. So let's go ahead and rename them. Now I'm going to use the prefix CTL for control, and then underscore and the name of the object. So this will be control foot left. This will be control heel left. And this will be control toe left. Now I want to position these under the foot and then align the pivots for this. Now when I created these, I have not worked with the pivots at all. So if I were to go into a move mode here, make sure I'm on object, you can see that the pivots are pretty much just centered to these objects. So in this case, I want this pivot to be kind of towards the back here. I want it to align with this joint. In fact, I'm going to turn off the geometry here. So I want this pivot to align with this, and this one also I want to pivot around this. So that way, when the heel lifts, it's all lifting around the ball of the foot. So the first thing I want to do is just select everything and move it in. So I'm going to move that in so that the foot control basically just touches the origin. And then I need to move these pivot points. So first thing I want to do is just go ahead and do snap to points and then hit the letter D to adjust that pivot. So I'm going to go ahead and snap that pivot to that joint, select this one, and again, snap that pivot to that joint. Let's go ahead and turn off snapping. So now when this lifts up, it's going to lift centered around that joint, and the same for this one here. Now, once we have these set up, we should also zero out our translations. So I'm going to do modify, freeze transformations, and that zeroes everything out for each one of these. Now, I'm going to also need to create the right side, so we can duplicate this. And let's go ahead and scale it -1 in X to flip it around. And then I'm going to position this one pretty much where the other one is positioned. And then the toe, I'm going to hold down the V to snap to points. This one here, snap to points again. So again, we've basically just mirrored this. And again, I need to get rid of that negative scale as well as the translation. So I'm going to do modify, freeze transformations. So now I've got both of these all aligned and ready to connect into the rig. Now let's set up the joints so that they have inverse kinematics for the legs and the feet. So again, I'm going to turn off the geometry so we can just see the skeletons. So what I want to do is create an inverse kinematics chain that allows me to adjust the leg, as well as one for the foot and another one for the heel. So all we have to do is go into skeleton, create IK handle. If we want, we can make sure we reset that tool, or we can go over to the rigging shelf and hit this button here. So I'm going to create 3 IK chains. So I'm going to select that hip joint on the left side and then the ankle. And what that does is it creates what's called an IK handle. And this IK handle allows me to manipulate that joint simply by positioning that handle. Now we want to create another IK handle for the toe. So again, I'm going to select my IK handle tool, click on the ball of the foot, and then the left toe. So now this IK handle operates the toe. And let's do one more for the heel. So I'm going to go from the ankle to the heel. And there we go. So now that I have all of these in place, I need to give it some descriptive names. So I'm going to use IK handle as my prefix and then just type underscore and the name of the joint. So in this case, it will be ankle underscore left. And this one be underscore toe left. And this one will be heel left. So now that all of these are in place, we can connect them into the controls to be able to manipulate the leg and the foot. With our IK handles in place, we can now start to connect them into the foot controls. So how is this going to work? Well, let's take a look at our outliner. So I've got a foot control, a heel control, and a toe control. Now, how do I want to animate this? Well, I would like to be able to move the foot control and have the heel and the toe go with it. So in that case, we need to create a hierarchy. So I'm going to select the left heel and the left toe, middle click and drag them over the foot. So now when I select the foot, they all select and I can move it. So I'm going to actually do the same for the right side as well. So let's go ahead and just do that right now. Now, these IK handles operate different parts of the leg and the foot. So the ankle controls everything. The toe just controls the front of the foot, and the heel controls the back. So your first indication is to say, let's just put all of these under the left foot control. So if I middle click and drag under control left foot, all of these are under there. So now all of these controls are a child of this foot control. So when I move it, the whole foot moves very nicely. But the problem is that I'm not getting any rotation on the toe or the heel. Well, we can fix some of that. So I'm going to go ahead and select the toe and basically make that a child of the toe control. So now I can rotate the toe control and the IK handle will go with it. Well, we can do the same for the heel. So I'm going to go ahead and put that under the heel control. And so when I rotate that, ooh, that doesn't work. Well, the reason that doesn't work is because when this heel lifts up, the ankle is also going to lift up, right? Because that's all part of this structure and it's all going to pivot around this ball of the foot. So I'm going to actually select that ankle control. So IK handle, ankle left, middle click and drag it under the heel. So now, when I rotate that, they both go. And now I can tap my heel. I can tap my toe. And if we move the foot, the character can go wherever he wants. And if I rotate that as well, it all stays into place. So as you can see, this is a very simple and straightforward way to set up feet and legs. So go ahead and do IK handles and set up your hierarchy for the right side as well, and we'll move on. Now that our feet are rigged, we can move on to the rest of the character's legs, and that means the hips and the knees. We're going to start off by rigging the hips. Now, before we do that, I'm just going to go ahead and turn off my geometry so we can see our rig. So I have my lower character here, and I can move that around. But what if I wanted the character to squat down or move from the hip down? Well, I need a control here in order to do that. Now, for this particular joint, you'll see that it already has an orientation. And so we created this with the default settings, and that means that X is pointed down that joint. So I want to create a control that's aligned with that joint. So let's go ahead and create a simple circle as our control, but I want it to be pointing down the X axis. Well, if I create it, it's going to be created in world space, and that means I need to create it pointed at the X axis. And the easiest way to do that is just create it in a side viewport. So I'm going to hop over to my side viewport. And as you can see, we're pointing directly down X. So if we draw the circle here, it should be aligned. So I'm going to go ahead and create a NURB circle, just drag it on the grid. And then I'm going to double click on my shape here and go down. And let's go ahead and set the radius to 2.5. So if we go out to our perspective window, you can see that the x-axis is pointed in the right direction. But I need to align this with this particular joint. And so we can do that very easily just with a constraint, in this case, a parent constraint. So I'm going to constrain the circle to the joint. So let's go ahead and select that joint first, shift select the circle, go into constrain parent. And we want to make sure that maintain offset is clicked off, and then click add. And what that does is it constrains it to the joint, snaps it exactly where we want, and it aligns it with orientation. So if we look at this in the outliner, you'll see that under this NURB circle, we have that constraint. Well, I can delete that. And now I can rename this. Let's call this control hip left. So that's my left hip control. Now, at this point, we've got a lot of numbers here to position this. Now, eventually, I will want to zero it out. Now, in this case, I'm going to put this as part of a hierarchy. And when you do that, you kind of need to zero it out at the end of the process. So I'm going to wait on zeroing things out until we're a little bit further down the process. But I can still connect this in to my leg. And so now all I need to do is constrain it the other way. So in this case, I'm going to select my control first, then my joint. And all I'm going to do is create a point constraint. So if we go into here, point constraint, and in this case, I do want maintain offset turned on, and click add. So now, when I move this, the leg moves with it. So let's go ahead and do this one more time for the right leg. And I'm just going to do it very, very quickly. So I'm going to create the control, size it to 2.5, hop out into a perspective view, select this right joint, select my circle, constrain parent with offset off, go into the outliner, delete that constraint, then select the controller and the joint, and do a point constraint. And now all I have to do is rename my control. So control hip right. So now I've got two controls here that will control my leg. Let's add one more control to the legs, and that will be for knee direction. Now for this, we're going to use what's called a pole vector constraint, and that basically will just aim the knee at a target. So in this case, I've got these two objects in the scene that I've added, and they're just curves. And this one's called control knee left and right. So we can do this by selecting the IK handle. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn off my geometry layer so we can see what we have. Now if I were to move this knee, you'll see that the knee always is pointed in the same direction. So we want to be able to change that if we want. So we do this by selecting the IK handle. So in this case, under control foot left, and then under the heel, we want to select that ankle IK handle. And that's the one that controls the leg and the knee. So that's the object that I want to have constrained. So in this case, I'm going to select the target first, control select IK handle ankle left, constrain pole vector. There are really no options for this other than wait. So we're going to go ahead and click add. Now notice how this little line comes up. So now when I move this up, select this knee control, you can see how that moves. So let's do the same for the right side. So I'm going to select the control first, then the constrained object, in this case IK handle ankle right, constrain pole vector. So now these knees will always point at our controls. We now have the lower part of our character rigged. Now, one of the things I haven't been doing is keeping house. In other words, making sure that the rig is nice and tidy. When you finally deliver the rig to an animator, you want to make sure that everything is airtight and ready to go. So let me show you some techniques for doing that. Now, the first one is just plain organization. So if I go into Windows Outliner, you'll see that I've got all of these nodes in place, and ultimately my character is going to be part of one continuous rig. So it's a good idea to have kind of a main control for your character. So I'm just going to create a NURBS circle here, fairly large, somewhere around, let's see, let's create it at, let's make it 10 units. And then I'm just going to center it to 0. Now, this is really important. You want your main node to always be at 0. And so we're going to call this control main. Now, we could also name it after our character. There's a number of ways to do that. Now, because this is 0, we're not going to introduce any problems when we reparent things. So I'm going to select everything in the rig, in other words, all my controls, middle click and drag, and make that main control my parent of everything else. And so now I've got kind of a main structure for that character. Now, in addition to this, I need to organize my layers. I'm going to select all of these objects here in my outliner, go over to my layers, highlight the controls layer, and then just add selected objects. And so now all of my controls should be in that layer. Now, another thing we can do is to start to restrict movement on the controllers. So something like this controller for the leg, I'll probably want to move and I may want to rotate it, but I don't need to scale it. So I don't want to give the animator any options that they don't absolutely need. And so in this case, I want to lock and hide these values. I'm going to left click and drag and select scale X, Y, and Z as well as visibility. And then I'm going to right click and do lock and hide selected. So when I select this object, these don't even show up. And if I go to scale it, it's completely grayed out. So I can't do that. And that just restricts the animator from that operation, makes your rig that much more bulletproof. Now, this toe and heel control can be a little bit more refined. So let's go ahead and select the control toe left. And what exactly are we going to do with that? Well, the only thing I can think about doing with that is tilt it up and down along the x-axis. So in this case, I want to restrict everything but that one control. So I'm going to left click and drag, select that, hold down control, select the rest of them. So everything but rotate X. And again, right click, lock and hide. So now if I try and rotate around any axis but X, it's impossible. And we can do the same for the heel. Now the heel is basically going to be the same. We're going to rotate that around X. So let's go ahead and select all these. Lock and hide everything but X. So now this is all locked down so that I don't accidentally move this in a way that's not supposed to. Now, another way to organize your rigs is to color code them. And so this will enable the animator to tell left from right from center very easily. Now, I'm going to go ahead and color code this with blue on the left and red on the right. And we can change the color of our curves simply by going into the attribute editor, going to the shape node, and then under object display, find drawing overrides, and we can enable overrides. Now these are already blue, but let's go ahead and change it to a different shade of blue so we can tell it apart. In other words, that kind of more of a lighter type of blue here. And so again, all I have to do is select each joint and give them the colors that they want. Now on this side, I'm going to go ahead and just go to a red color. And now, when you look at the rig, it's very easy to tell left from right. So as you go through the rig, you want to make sure that you color code your left, right, and center. So go ahead and clean up the rest of your rig, and we'll move on to the rest of the body. Now let's move on to rigging the body. And by this, I mean everything from the hips up through the spine to the shoulders. Now we're going to start with a couple of controls towards the hips and the base of the spine. And I've already drawn these controls here. And this one here is called Control Pelvis. And that will control the orientation of the hips, allow the character to rock his hips if we need to. And then the other one is Control Body. And that will be kind of our main central point where the spine and the hips connect together. Now, I simply drew these by creating a NURB circle and reshaping it. And by doing that, I've aligned my axes so that basically they're aligned with the world. But we want these aligned with the joints in the upper part of the character. So if I were to select, say, this control here, you'll see that the x-axis is pointed down. We've got Z left and right, and Y forward and back. And so I want these to be aligned along that axis. One way to do this is to rotate it exactly the way that we want and then freeze transformations. And by that, I mean I want this object to be facing towards the x-axis here with the z-axis to what would normally be the left-right. So in this case, I'm going to rotate it this way, so -90 along Z, and then rotate it this way, which would be 90 along Y. And what this does is that you can see here, here's my axes, and so this is kind of aligned in that way. And so if I do a modify freeze transformations, that aligns the object to those axes. So now what I can do is I can position this in the rig and have it aligned. So I'm going to hide my geometry here. And let's go ahead and move this. Now I'm going to hold down V to snap 2 points here. And let's snap that to the base of the spine. Now, as you can see, this isn't quite rotated exactly the way that we want. So I kind of need to rotate my way back out of this. So I need to rotate it, say, -90 in Z and 90 in X. And then I'm going to move this down a little bit. So right around there would be a good place in the character here. And I'm going to template my character here so you can see how this is positioned with respect to my character. So I'm actually going to move this a little bit forward so it's more centered to the actual hips on the character. So the next one we need to connect is this one. And again, I want to align this to the X and Y axes. So I remember I did -90 in Z and then 90 in Y. That looks about right. So again, I want this to be aligned with these axes here. Now the local axes aren't aligned, but as soon as we do modify freeze transformations, everything snaps into place. Awesome. And now let's go ahead and snap that so it's centered, and then rotate that down, -90, and then I think it's 90 in X. Right, so now I've got this as kind of my main control, and everything else underneath it. Now, once I have this in place, I do need to connect everything together, and we'll do that next. With our body and pelvis controls in place, we can now connect everything together. So let's zoom in here, and I'm actually going to turn my geometry to template here so we can kind of see everything. Now let's take a look at the outliner. So I've got this, these two here are actually outside of the main hierarchy. So I'm going to go ahead and left click and middle click and drag them above control main. And then I'm going to take the pelvis, middle click and drag that above the body. So now it's a child of that. And then the hips, left and right, middle click and drag them below the pelvis. So now we have our control structure. So how this works is that the body control basically is for main positioning of the body. The pelvis control is a place where we can kind of just wiggle the hips. So there are many times when you'll need to tilt the hips left or right or whatever. And then these lower controls, hips left and right, those are more for real fine tuning, and you can actually move those to kind of fine tune the positioning. Now, this is actually all in place, but nothing is zeroed out. So in this case, we've got a lot of random numbers here. Well, they're not random, but we have a lot of numbers here. And so we need to zero these out. Now, we're going to zero them out from the top down. In other words, I'm going to go to the top of the hierarchy, which is the hips, then do the pelvis, then do the body. So we do this by transferring all of these numbers into what we call our offset parent matrix. And what that does is it essentially clears out the channel box so that we have zeros here, and just those numbers in the channel box go into what's called the offset parent matrix, which is this right here. So basically, these numbers, I want to go from here to here. Now, I could just literally cut and paste these numbers from here to here, but there's an easier way by using the node editor. So let's go into the node editor. Now, I'm going to hit this button to clear it out and then just hit plus with my hips left selected. And so now I've got my node here, and I'm going to open that up. And all we need to do is connect this matrix to the offset parent matrix. And so this matrix is essentially your channel box. So left click and drag, connect it there, select other, offset parent matrix. Now, when I do this, it actually jumps that object all the way over here. And that's because we have a double transform. If you notice here, we've got it in the translate, our standard translate, as well as the offset parent. So the first thing we want to do is break that connection and then reselect that node, go over to the channel box, highlight all translate and rotate, and zero those out. So now those values that were previously in the channel box are in my offset parent matrix, and I've got a clean channel here with which to animate. So let's do that again on the hips. So I'm going to clear this out, hit plus, open up that node, matrix to offset parent matrix. It jumps out in the middle of nowhere. We delete the link, highlight the node again, zero out, translate, and rotate. So now that's cleared out. Let's go ahead and do the pelvis. Clear my node editor, load in pelvis, open it up, matrix to offset parent, break the connection, and then zero out the values. So as you can see, it's a very straightforward process once you get the hang of it. So let's do one more. Again, I've loading control body, selecting matrix, connecting to offset parent. Notice how this kind of just goes totally haywire, but we break that connection, reselect that node, and zero out rotation and translation. So now I've got my rig zeroed out. So in this case, I've got now my body controls, my pelvis controls, as well as my hips. Now, if I want, I can go and start restricting things such as rotation. So for example, my pelvis control, I only want that to be rotation. So I'm going to go ahead and select translate and scale and lock and hide selected. So as you work through your rigs, you do want to remember to lock those values you don't want to translate. So now we have our main body controls and we can move on to the spine. Now let's move on to rigging the spine. For the spine, we're going to have one control per joint. And in this case, we have 4 sets of joints in the spine. And we're going to use this basic control. And that's essentially looks like a guitar pick, but again, it's just a nerve circle that I deformed. Now, the first thing we need to do is create multiple controls and align them with the skeleton. So in this case, I've already drawn this so that it's aligned with the x-axis. So the x-axis is pointing up and down, which is the same as the joints in the character. Now I'm going to align this with the joint using a parent constraint. Now we've done this before, but let's go through the process again. I'm going to select the joint, in this case, skeleton spine 1, select my control, which is called control spine 1, and then do a constrain parent. Now I want to make sure that maintain offset is turned off, and that will snap everything to the right place. So go ahead and click add. And now what this does is it snaps it to the right place and aligns it perfectly. We can see now that the control is pretty much centered to that joint and it's oriented in the right direction. Now, when this was created, if we look in the outliner, that spine 1 has a parent constraint on it. So we're going to delete that parent constraint, and that will leave it aligned but unattached. So I'm going to copy this. So I hit Control D, and that will copy it to spine 2, control spine 2. So let's go ahead and select skeleton spine 2, and then select the control, constrain parent. So that's the second one. Delete that parent constraint. Duplicate 2 to make 3. Select the skeleton joint number 3. Select the control number 3. Parent. Delete the constraint. One more time. Duplicate the control. Select the joint. Select the control. Parent. And then delete that constraint. So now if I turn on my geometry here, you'll see that we've got this pretty much aligned. Now this one is a little bit off, but we can always adjust this just by moving the spine itself. So if I right click, go to hull, select that hull, I can basically just move it to center it. And I can do that for this one as well. So I'm going to go ahead and select Hull, select that, and I'm literally just moving the curve itself. So now my controls look pretty good. Let's do that one too. And so I'm not moving the pivot, I'm just moving the shape or the curve. So now with all of these in place, we can link them into the hierarchy, and then we can start to connect everything. So the first thing I want to do is these are actually going to be below this body joint, right? So when I move this around, I want the spine to move with it. So I'm going to go ahead and create a hierarchy. So I'm going to middle click and drag spine 4 to 3, 3 to 2, 2 to 1. So now I've got basically a bottom to top hierarchy of this, and then select the spine 1 and connect it into the body. So now when I move that, everything moves with it. Now, once I have this in place, I will need to attach everything to the skeleton, and we'll do that next. We now have our spine controls in place, and all we have to do is zero those out and then connect them into the actual skeleton. So we've got a couple of controls here. So if I select these, you'll see we have some numbers on those. So they do have translation. I'm going to hide my geometry so we can see this a little bit better. So we want to zero these out. Now we can do this using offset parent matrix, and we've seen how to do that already in the node editor. But I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do it in the attribute editor. And it's just another way of doing this. So this one is actually pretty simple. So this will be easy. So this has just one translate and one rotate value. So I have control spine 4 selected. So let's hop over to the attribute editor. I'm going to select my main node here. And you'll see that under transform attributes, I have those two values here and here. So I have one translate X, one rotate Z. Now all I have to do is just copy and paste these into my offset parent matrix. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and paste it. So I've done X. Now when I do that, I do have a double transform because I have this value here, but all I have to do is zero that out and it snaps back into place. And then again, I can copy rotate Z and paste it into rotate Z in my offset matrix and go ahead and zero that out. So now this is exactly the same way as if I had done it in the node editor. And this works fine for this one because it only had a couple of values. So let's do that one more time with spine 3, which again only has two values. Let's do this in the attribute editor. So translate X, copy, paste, and then 0. Rotate Z, copy, paste, and then 0 that out. Again, the same effect. So let's go back to the node editor, which I find to be a little bit faster anyways. So let's go into Windows Node Editor. And I'm going to clear out my node editor here, clear the graph, make sure I have my object selected, and then hit the plus sign here. And then I'm going to expand that node. And remember what we did? We took the matrix, plugged it into its own offset parent matrix. That makes everything jump, but we break the connection, reselect the node, and then zero out the transforms. And let's do that one more time for the spine 1. So I'm going to select that, clear the graph, reload it, expand it, select my matrix, plug it into offset parent, delete the connection, select the node again, and zero out all those transforms. So now I have all of this pretty much ready to go. And all I have to do now is connect the skeleton to the controls. Now we can do that using constraints. Now there's a couple of ways of doing this. If I go into my rigging menu under constraints, the two main ways are just to use a parent constraint, which will control translation and rotation. Or if you want to do them separately, you can do a point and an orient constraint. So a point is basically translation, orient is rotation. And if you want, you can add in scale. So we're going to do a parent constraint. So I'm going to select my control first, my joint second. So I'm selecting control spine 4 and skeleton spine 4. We're going to do parent constraint. I want to make sure that maintain offset is on. Click add. Let's do the same for this one. So select control, then the joint, parent constraint, control, then the joint, parent constraint, control, then the joint, parent. So now that this is all in place, I should be able to rotate these. Yep. And if I select multiple ones, I should be able to do this sort of rotation. And we've got this all connected together. So now we have our spine rigged up and ready to go. Now let's take a look at some ways to rig the shoulders. Now I'm going to show you a couple of different ways. So here we have our shoulder, and I've already kind of put it into place. And typically you just want this to move up and down, and then the shoulder goes with it, so the character can shrug his shoulders. Now this will also be the base of the arm hierarchy. Now one of the ways to do this is to simply drag it into the outliner. So if I go into my character here, you'll see at the top of my spine, I have spine 4. So I can just select this control shoulder left, middle click and drag, and now that's part of the spine. And so if I were to say, so set a key here, rotate them, set another key. So if I were to animate that, the shoulder would go with it. Now, this is a perfectly good way to rig characters. Plenty of characters are rigged this way. But one of the things I find is that this starts to create a very, very deep hierarchy. So right now I have the shoulder, but if I had the shoulder and then the bicep and all the way out to the fingers, you're going to have a really deep hierarchy. And that might not be animator friendly. So what we can do is we can find a way to rig in the shoulder and then the arm in a more flat style. So I'm going to middle click and drag this under main. So, it would be great to have a way to rig this so that I can easily access the shoulder, because that's a part of the character that we are going to work with a lot, the shoulder and the arm. So one way to do it is to simply use a constraint. Now, if I constrained this shoulder directly to the skeleton, I wouldn't be able to move it because it would tie up all of my translation channels. But I can put an intermediary into place. So I'm going to select this NURB circle down here. And let's go ahead and just move it up and snap it to, say, this joint here, right towards the top. So I can constrain this to that joint. So I'm going to select this joint, then select my NURB circle. I'm going to go ahead and middle click and drag it in. And then I'm going to select my joint and the circle. And we can just do a parent constraint. So make sure you have maintain offset on. Click add. And so now this goes with that. And if I select that shoulder, middle click and drag, I can now have that shoulder go with it. And if I wanted to, I could move the shoulder and it won't snap. So that's pretty cool. But this is actually still a little messy, So I have this circle here that is kind of doing nothing. So it's kind of just sitting there in the hierarchy. And then I have this parent constraint, which again is kind of just messing things up. So I want this to be as clean as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that out, and let's go ahead and delete this circle. And again, that would have been a perfectly good way to rig it as well. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'm going to show you an even cleaner way of doing this. So in this case, we're going to use what's called a proximity constraint, which constrains the object to a piece of geometry. So I have to create some geometry. So I'm going to go into poly modeling here, and let's just create, I can create anything really. I'm going to create a polygon disk, and let's go ahead and drag that up. Now, this is geometry, so you want to make sure that you set it so it doesn't render. That's one of the key things of this. But I'm going to go ahead and just snap it to the top of this joint again. And let's go ahead and scale that down just a bit. And then I'm just going to do a freeze transformations. Now, in this case, I'm actually going to put it in the hierarchy of the skeleton. So I'm going to open up my skeleton, and let's open up our spine, and that's called joint 5. So I'm going to go ahead and select my disc, middle click and drag. And so now that disc is moving with everything else. And so all I have to do is select that disc, shift select my shoulder control, and then do constrain proximity pin. And if we want, we can look at the options here, but basically you just want to leave these at default and then click add. Now what this does is it actually pins this to the geometry. It creates what's called a pin input, which is this piece of geometry. And then now that moves. And so the nice thing is it doesn't tie up this channel. So if I were to move this spline, it's not going to snap. So I can actually animate that. And it's a very, very clean rig. So this is a really cool way to rig. And so if I select that little piece of geometry, I just want to go into the attribute editor, and under render stats, I want to make sure that I turn off basically everything. I don't want it to be visible in anything. And I could also, if I wanted to, I could also turn off visibility just to make sure that it does not render. So those are 3 ways to rig a shoulder. And the key takeaway for this is that sometimes you want your controls to be a little bit flatter. If your hierarchies get too deep, sometimes it's really hard to animate and navigate the rig. In this chapter, we're going to take a look at how to set up an FK-IK switch for the character's arm. Now, before we actually dig into this, I want to show you kind of an exploded view of how a typical FK-IK setup works and how that is rigged. Now, in the middle here, I have my actual skeleton. This will be what is deforming the geometry. Now, that skeleton is controlled by 2 additional sets of joints. We have an FK joint up here and an IK joint down here. So when we switch between FK and IK, we're actually switching between 2 sets of joints that are controlling this. So in this case, I have this IK handle for the IK joint. And on this, I've created an attribute called FKIK. When it's at 0, it's completely FK, forward kinematics. When it's IK, it's inverse. And in the middle, it's halfway between. So I'm going to type in 0.5 here. And I'll show you how this basically works. So what we've done is we've constrained this skeletal joint to both of these. And so if we look in the outliner, you'll see I have 2 constraints here, one for this joint and this joint. And so that is basically split between these 2. And that balance of that split is controlled here. So when it's at 0, it's completely FK, and when it's at 1, it's completely IK. So if I want to, I can rotate my FK, but that won't take effect until I select my IK handle and switch it over. So as you can see, this is not a trivial setup, but it's actually fairly straightforward. So what we have to do is create 2 chains, one for FK and IK, and then connect all of that together to our main skeleton. Now let's actually create our FK-IK rig. We're going to start off by creating some joints. But before we get started, I just want to let you know that I've already created some control hierarchy here. So I've created an FK series of controls here. And then I've created IK as well. So I've created a hand and a shoulder control. And in the outliner, I've placed them under the main control here. So here I have hand, and then under the shoulder, I've got my 2 biceps, my elbows for FK, and so on. So I've already linked them in and zeroed them out. Now we do this basically the same way we've been doing with all of our controls. So if you can look at how we've done the spine, that would be a good guide for how to place these controls. I'm going to go ahead and hide the geometry and also hide the controls. So what I want to do is just work with these skeletal joints here. So I'm going to go into my outliner, and under my skeleton hierarchy, I have skeleton shoulder left, elbow, and wrist. So I want to make sure I select those, and then I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate them. Now, when you do that, it actually duplicates the fingers as well. So I'm going to go ahead and select all those fingers and delete them. And then I'm going to select that shoulder copy, middle click, and drag outside the hierarchy. So now I've got this control here. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that one more time. So now we should have two control rigs here. So I'm going to actually move these out. So I'm going to move this one this way and move this one the other way. So this one on the top side, let's go ahead and rename that. So instead of shoulder left one, let's call it FK left. And then elbow FK and wrist FK. And the other one is obviously going to be called IK. So shoulder IK left, elbow IK left, wrist IK left. So now I have these three chains. Now the IK chain does need an IK handle on. So I'm going to go skeleton, create IK handle, click at the beginning, at the shoulder, and then at the wrist. So now I've got an IK handle as well. So I'm going to call this IK handle arm left. And I'm going to go ahead and move that up just a little bit there. So now I should have three objects here. I have this skeletal hierarchy for FK, another one for IK, and then the IK handle. With our control skeletons in place, we can now rig them to the controls themselves. So let's zoom in here. And I'm going to turn on my controls layer. And that will reveal all the controls that we have. Now there's two sets of controls. There's this one here, which is my FK control, and that will control my FK joints. And then I have this control and this control, which will control IK. So this one's kind of at the shoulder and that one's at the hand. So in order to make this a little bit more visible, I'm going to actually move these controls out so that they snap to the joints we're connecting them to. So I'm going to go ahead and go into move mode. I'm selecting my bicep FK left, which is the FK control. So I'm going to hold down the letter V and snap it to the top of that chain, and everything else should snap into place. And then we'll do the same for this control. Snap that. Snap this. To that joint. And then select this one. Again, hold down the letter V, snap it to that joint. So each one of these is going to be constrained to its control. So if I wanted to animate FK, I'm going to be moving these controls. And so we can do the FK side with either parent or point and orient constraints. And this one, we're going to need a point constraint here at the shoulder. And then I also need to connect orientation here. So I'm just going to use point and orient for both of these. Now you can use parent for the FK. So I'm going to go ahead and select my control, select my joints, and then under constrain, I want to make sure I do point, maintain offset, and then orient. And you want to make sure that maintain offset is on. And then again, select my control, my joint, point orient, control, joint, point orient. Now the next one, this shoulder, I actually just want to constrain position. So I'm going to select the control, then the joint, and this time I'm just going to select point. Now for the IK handle, I actually want this IK handle to be a child of my control. So that means we're going into the outliner. I'm going to select this control, which is my hand IK. And then I have my IK handle for my arm. Middle click and drag that so that it is a child of this. So now, if I move this, it should move everything. Great. Now, the one thing that we don't have is we don't have the orientation of that wrist joint. So if I were to, say, rotate my hand, that's not going to affect that wrist. So I'm going to select my IK hand control, then select this end joint here, go constrain, orient. So now when I rotate this, it should rotate the wrist. So now that we have all of these in place, we can actually connect our control skeletons to the actual skeleton in our character. With our control skeletons in place, we can now rig them to the controls that we created. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on this controls layer. And so we have two sets of controls. We have this one for FK, and then I have this control and this control for IK. Now these are zeroed out, and that's great, but I'm actually going to move them over the corresponding joints to create the constraints, and then we can move all that back. So I'm just going to go ahead and select my bicep FK left, and then just hold down the V key and snap that over to my FK chain. Now my hand, again, I'm going to hold down V to snap. I'm going to snap that right here to where that IK handle is. And then this little one here is my bicep IK control. And so let's go ahead and snap that. So now with these snapped, we can constrain them. So I'm going to go ahead and constrain these joints to the controls. So I need to select the control first and the joint second. The joint is being constrained. And then we can do a point constraint, make sure we have maintain offset, and then an orient constraint. And again, maintain offset. Same for this. Point, orient, and then point and orient. So now this chain should move around with the other joint. And the nice thing is that when I zero out this, it snaps right back to where I want. But I'm going to leave that outside for just a little bit so we can kind of see how this rig is being built. Now we can do the same for this. So I'm going to go ahead and select the IK control, then the IK joint, the top joint, and hit point and orient constraint. And then with this hand, we're not going to do a constraint. We're actually just going to parent the IK handle. So let's go into our outliner, find that IK handle, middle click and drag that over the hand. So now, when I move the hand, that joint moves, and then I can also manipulate the shoulder if I need to. So it's basically the same way that we rigged the hips and the feet earlier on in the course. So now with these in place, we can now start to connect these joints to our skeleton and begin our FK-IK switch. We're now almost ready to wire up our skeleton to our FK and IK controls. But before we do that, let's go ahead and create a floating control that will make it a lot easier to switch between FK and IK. Now, in the example I showed you at the beginning of this chapter, I just used an attribute at the end of the IK chain. But a lot of times it's easier for the animator to have something like this, so a control that goes left and right that can switch between FK and IK. So as you can see, I've got these objects in the scene here. And if we go into the outliner, you'll see we've got four objects. We've got a box called FK-IK left. We've got a label for FK and IK. And then we have the actual control itself. Now, when we create controls like this, you want this control to be attached to something because you need to be able to zero it out. Right now, it's kind of in a weird place. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually select this and the labels and middle click and drag them into this control here. And now I'm going to move this arrow over to the left, and we're just going to do a modify freeze transformations. And so now we have a 0 point, and so I can go between 0 and 1, and those are the numbers I need to be able to switch from FK to IK. Now with this control selected, I also don't want it to go anything higher than 1 or lower than 0. And so we can go into our attribute editor, select the main node here, and then scroll down to limit information. And under translate, you're going to see a minimum and a maximum, and we want them checked. And so the minimum for this is going to be 0. The max is going to be 1. And so now I can't move that control anything further than 0 or 1, but I still can move it up and down and forward and back. And so we need to basically just select all of these in the channel box, right click, lock and hide. And so now this can only move left and right. And now I can use this as the basis for my switch between IK and FK. With my FK-IK control in place, we can now wire the whole rig up. Now, we've already set up our constraints on this joint here. So if I go into Windows Outliner, select my skeleton shoulder left, you'll see that each one of these has a constraint. So we have a constraint for the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist. So each one of these has 2 inputs. So we have a FK input and an IK input. So the balance of those two will determine how far in between those two this particular joint will bend. So what we need to do is connect all of these up with this control. So I'm going to go ahead and select this control. It's called Control FK-IK left, and all the constraints. And then we're going to go ahead and open up our node editor. Now I'm going to go ahead and clear out my node editor and just load what we have selected here. So I should get 4 nodes here, FK, IK, as well as the constraints. Now you may get some shape nodes as well, depending upon how you have your node editor set up. So let's go ahead and open this up. So this is our FK, IK control. So in other words, that's this. And so this is going to move along X from 0 to 1. Now remember, these constraints also go from 0 to 1. So I need to determine which side of this is going from 0 to 1. So I'm going to make IK 1. And so when this control is on the IK side, it's at 1. And so these constraints will be tilted towards IK. When the control is at 0, it's FK. So from 0 to 1 is pretty easy. All I have to do is plug translate X into that constraint. But I need to flip it around as well. I need to go from 1 to 0 in addition to the 0 to 1. And so we can accomplish that with a really cool node called reverse. So I'm going to hit tab, type in the word reverse, and select that node. Now this node is basically built for this exact purpose. So it's got 3 inputs here and 3 outputs. And what it's going to do is it's going to expect a 0 to 1 input, and it's going to output 1 to 0. And so it's basically just going to flip that control around. So I'm going to go ahead and plug translate X into input X. And so this will be my opposite. This will be my FK. So let's go ahead and start with the original here. So I'm going to connect translate X into my first constraint. And you can see each one of these is labeled. So I want to select the IK one, which is the second one on the list. Do the same for the next constraint, IK and IK. Okay, so that set up IK. And so this one here, we need the output here to go to FK. And so now that should work. So let's go ahead and select, say, the hand, move that IK handle over. And now, when that's at 1, it's IK. When it's 0, it's FK. There we go. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to undo my way out of that. And let's zero out our rig as well. So I'm going to go ahead and select this control here, my arm bicep FK, and I'm just going to zero out that translate Z. Select this, zero out translate Z. Select the hand, and again, zero out all those controls. So now I've got my controls in place and my FK, IK is rigged. So we have this pretty much in place, but there's a few more things we can do to fine tune this control. We now have our FK and IK rig set up, but we can do a couple more things just to make it user friendly. One of the things that we're not seeing here is we're not seeing the actual switch. If we're totally in FK mode, we don't want to see the IK controls and vice versa. So I'm going to show you how to quickly hide and show the controls depending upon how the switch is set. So I'm going to go into my node editor, and I already have my nodes set up here. Now, if you don't have this in your window, go ahead and just select your constraints and your control and load it up. And if you don't quite get this reverse, you can play with this traverse button here, and that should bring it up. Now, what we want to do is we want to load a couple more nodes into the node editor. So I'm going to go into my outliner, and let's start with the labels FK and IK. So those are located down here. And so I've got this label here and this label here. So I'm going to go ahead and select those, and let's add them in. And here we have them. And if we open them up, you'll see that they're just basic nodes. And so all I need to do is be able to control the visibility of this. And I already have something here that goes from 0 to 1 and 1 to 0. So when this is IK, it's coming directly off of translate. So I'm going to open up translate here, select X. So when X goes from 0 to 1, IK turns on. So I'm going to connect that into visibility. And then the output of the reverse should go to the FK. And you can see this is already happening here. So now when I go FK, IK, FK, IK. So each one of those is now taking control and it's turning on and off. Well, we can do the same for all of these control curves as well. So I'm going to select my FK curves here, go back into my node editor. Getting a little messy here, so let's go ahead and reduce these, make them smaller. I'm going to go ahead and select these again and load them into the node editor. And again, exactly the same thing. So I'm going to expand these. And so each one of these are the FK. So that comes off the reverse. Visibility, visibility, visibility. And then minimize those. So now those go away. when it goes to FK. And let's do the same for IK. So again, select that one, shift select that one, go into the node editor, load those up, select them, expand them. And again, I'm on a small screen here, so it's kind of hard to see. But so these are IK, and so that would be directly off of Translate X. So again, plug that into visibility and plug that into visibility, and then just shrink them down. So now we've got FK and IK. FK, IK. So as we switch, the controls will automatically hide and show depending upon what mode you're in. Now this control here, the FK-IK control, we can place that pretty much anywhere we want in our hierarchy. Typically I place it probably under the left shoulder here. It's a good place to place it, so that way as the character turns, this kind of moves along with it. So hopefully this gives you some good insight in how to create FK and IK. And if you want to practice, you can totally do the right side of the character. Now let's move on to rigging hands. There are a number of different ways that you can rig hands, and I'm going to show you just one method, and hopefully this will give you some ideas that you can use in your own rigs. Now for this rig, we're going to keep it fairly simple, but I've got two sets of controls here. So I've got these controls, which I will use to directly manipulate each individual finger. Now right now I only have the index finger. And then in addition to this, I'm going to have this master control, which will allow me to curl all of the fingers as well as spread them. So when I have multiple controls like this, I will need to have multiple nodes onto which to add those rotations. So what I'm going to do is take these nodes here and I'm going to zero them out and place them at the origin. So let me go ahead and turn off the geometry and the skeleton so you can see this a little bit better. So I'm going to go ahead and select this first one. Which is Control Index 1L. And I'm just going to zero out the translations. And notice how it snaps to the origin, which is great. And let's do that for the next one and the next one. So all three of these are now at the origin. And the reason I place them at the origin is so I can group them and have a group that is at 0. So in other words, I've kind of zeroed them out. And then when I select one of these, I'm going to group it. So I'm going to group this, and now that group's at 0. This is also at 0. So we've kind of got everything already kind of organized. Now I'm going to rename this group. We're going to call it offset, let's say index 1_L. Okay. And so now I've got my control, but it's underneath an offset node. So let's do that again for index 2. Group it. Rename the group offset index 2L for left. Select this one and group it again. So now I have these three, and they're still not parented. So let's go ahead and actually, I'm going to go ahead and move these apart a little bit so I can kind of see them. So I'm going to take 2 and move that. Now I'm moving the offset, not the object. We want to keep those objects at 0. So I'm going to just go ahead and build a little hierarchy here. And then I'm going to move this up towards the hand. And let's go ahead and turn on the skeleton so we can see that. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and just snap that to the hand. Now, just like with anything else, we do want to orient these to the joints. So I'm not going to orient the controls. I'm going to orient the offsets. So let's go ahead and select each offset. And I'm just going to move these into place. So I'm going to snap each offset to its corresponding joint. Something like that. But I still need to orient it. So I'm going to use parent constraints to create that offset. So I'm going to select the joint, Control select the offset in the outliner. If I were to click on this object here, I would click on the actual curve, but we want to select the offset. And then constrain parent and make sure maintain offset is off. And go ahead and hit add. And then just like before, we delete that parent constraint. Then we move on to the next one. So I'm going to select this joint, Control select offset index 2, constrain parent, delete that constraint, and then one more. Select this joint, select the offset 3, parent, and delete that offset. So now all of these are aligned. So if I were to look at the x-axis, it's pointed straight down the joints, and we should have everything aligned so that we can rotate them. Now, these controls were zeroed out when I grouped them, so that means that they are also aligned. And so sending them back to the origin was just an easy way to get things aligned quickly. And now that these are aligned, we can connect them into our hand skeleton. We now have our fingers in place, and we can now connect it into the rig. So let's take a look at where we're at here. If I go into the outliner, you'll see I've got my offset, and then a control, and then the child of that control is another offset, then another control, offset, control. So make sure that your hierarchy is set up this way. And then if we go to this initial offset, you'll see that, well, we've got a lot of garbage numbers in here. And we can just go ahead and place those in the offset parent matrix like we've done before. So let's go ahead and do that in the node editor. So I'm going to go into my node editor, and let's go ahead and clear that out and load up the offset node. So offset index L. And then I can just click here, and remember we're connecting matrix into offset parent matrix. And then we delete the connection, select the node, zero out the transforms. Okay, let's do that again. Let's select offset 2, clear out our node editor, load it up. Matrix connects to offset parent. Now the values are transferred, delete it, select, and you can see here it's a little bit off, but when I zero it out, it snaps right back. And so let's do the last one. And again, I have to select these in the outliner. If I were to select here, I'd select the control, not the offset. So we want to make sure we select the offset. And then load that up. Plug the matrix into the offset parent matrix. Break the connection and zero out the node. Okay, so everything should be 0. So that's 0. The controls are also 0. So we've got lots and lots of nice zeros here. So what we're going to do is that the controls are going to directly manipulate the joints, and then the offsets are going to be controlled by the finger manipulator, okay? So let's go ahead and select one of these controls. And so we're going to basically just use a parent constraint to manipulate the joints. So if I go into constrain, parent, I want to make sure maintain offset is on, click add, select this control, this joint, parent, this control, this joint, parent. So now I should be able to rotate these. So with these in place, I now have basically a rig that manipulates the fingers. But we also have these offsets. And one of the nice things about these offsets is that I can also manipulate the offsets as well. And I'm going to manipulate those in the next video. I now have my main finger controls in place, but we're going to create some additional controls as well. So let's take a look at where we're at. Now, in addition to the index finger, I went ahead and did all of the other fingers, and that was a little bit of a chore. But now that it's done, we can start to work on this master fingers control. And we're going to use this to both curl and spread the fingers. Now, the first thing we want to do is make sure that this is connected into the rig. Now, I've already set the pivot to be the same as the wrist. So the pivot's way over here, and I've snapped it to the wrist. And so what we're going to do is we're going to constrain this to the wrist, so when the wrist moves around, this moves around, and the finger controls move around. So I'm going to select the wrist, in other words, the skeletal wrist, not the IK or the FK, but just the main skeleton, and then select the control fingers left. And then for constraints, we're going to do a point and an orient. And we want to make sure that maintain offset is on. So now when this rotates, everything moves with it. Okay, so now that we've got that in place, we need to add in some attributes to control the bend and spread of the fingers. And we can do that in the channel box. We go Edit, Add Attribute. And so this Add Attribute allows us to type in a name. So let's go ahead and do fingers curl underscore left. What type of data is that? It's a float. It's basically just a number. And then the minimum and the maximum. Well, I honestly don't know what the minimum and maximum will be, so I'm just going to give it two numbers that are pretty far apart, and then we can fine-tune those later. So let's just go ahead and put in -45 for minimum, +45 for maximum. Click OK, and now I get that attribute. Let's add one more attribute. And this time, we're going to call it fingers spread left. And minimum and maximum, let's do -10 to +10. So I'm thinking 10 degrees. Let's go 15, actually. -15 to +15. And the default's going to be 0. Okay, so -15 to +15, 0. And I know I'm going to change this later, but we'll go ahead and tweak that when we get to it. So now I have these two values. But I am never going to move this. I'm never going to rotate it. I'm never going to scale it. So let's go ahead and select all of these from Translate all the way to Visibility, right-click, Hide Selected. So now when you select this, all you get are those finger curl and spread values, and that's all you can do. So now that this is in place, we have to wire it into our rig. Now let's go ahead and connect up the attributes that we created to our fingers to make them curl. So again, we've got this control here, and I've got a fingers curl attribute that I can animate. So let's go into our outliner. So I've got these offsets, and those are what we're going to use to curl those fingers. So let's start with the index finger because we can see it easiest. I'm going to shift select the offsets and then the finger control. And let's go into the node editor. So I'm going to go ahead and clear it out and hit plus. And so what I've got is I've got this control fingers and then each one of these offsets. So what I want to do is if I select control fingers, you'll see in the channel box, I have that finger curl attribute. And then if I expand this, you'll see that way down here, I've got that finger curl and finger spread. So I want to take this and plug it into an attribute in that offset. And what is that attribute? Well, if I select one of these offsets and look at the axes here, I'm just hitting W, I'm looking at my rotate. You can see that when I rotate around Z or Z, that's what I want. So I want to connect finger curl to rotate Z. So all I have to do is select this, connect it in, rotate Z, Now notice what it does. It creates this unit conversion. And what we have here is we've got this number coming out here, but it's not really a rotational value. So Maya is kind enough to stick that in, but it kind of resets everything. But now that I have this, I can take that output and plug it into the other ones. I don't need multiple unit conversions. So let's go ahead and plug all of those in. So now this should work. So when I've got this, I take my finger curl. If I go positive, it goes backwards. If I go negative, it goes forward. So 45 might not be enough. 45 this way is way too much. So let's go ahead and adjust that. So let's go edit, edit attribute. I'm going to select finger curl. So the minimum, let's go ahead and make that say, let's say negative 75. And for the maximum, that's actually going to be pretty low. Let's make that 20, which might even be too much. So now let's try that. So, 20 is way too much. So let's say right about here, basically 5. And then, yeah, that's great. So let's go ahead one more time, edit attribute, finger curl. So let's make the maximum 5. And instead of 75, let's make it negative 70. So that should work. So I've got a curl, but in addition to that, on top of that, I can also fine tune and pose the fingers. So now I can select this, and if I zero that out, it goes back. So let's go ahead and do this one more time for the middle fingers, and then I'll let you go ahead and do the other ones. So I'm going to go into my outliner, select these nodes here, my offsets for my middle finger plus the control fingers. Node editor. Let's go ahead and add in the nodes. And actually, I'm just adding in those additional nodes. So I can just keep going with this. So let's go ahead and take that output of the unit conversion, put it into rotate Z of this one, rotate Z, and rotate Z. So now finger curl is doing both. And so now you can kind of see how this works. So if I want to, I can select that and drag it to fine tune the pose. So I'm going to leave the other ones for you to do. And as you can see, it's a very straightforward process. Now let's set up the controls for finger spread. Now I've already finished off my finger curl, so you can see I have that in place. So let's go ahead and do the spread of the fingers. So let's go into our outliner. Now, if I go into this offset index, you can see when I rotate this along Y, that's what spreads my fingers. So I want to go all the way out to, say, maybe negative 30. And on this side, maybe about 5. And so this is going from 5 to negative 30. On the pinky side, it's the opposite. So it's going to go from negative 5 to positive 30. And so to make this control a little bit more rational, I'm actually going to go from positive 30 to negative 5. So let's go ahead and edit our attribute of that. So I'm going to select my finger control, highlight that attribute, finger spread L, edit attribute, select it. So instead of negative 15, we're going to go negative 5 to positive 30. Hit close. And let's start off with the pinky. But I'm actually going to select all of these and then the fingers. And let's go into our node editor. So I'm going to clear out my node editor and then load these back up. So I've got my pinky is down here. And so finger spread, all I need to do is click and drag that into rotate. But I can't see rotate because I already have something else plugged into rotate. So I'm going to drag that into rotate Y. And notice how it brings in this unit conversion. And so that extra node is needed to make that work. Now, when I've got this, now if I do my finger spread, you'll see my pinky works. That's awesome. But we need to do the index finger. Now, the index finger is going to be a little bit different, right? Because it's going to be the exact opposite. We need to multiply this value by -1. So I'm going to hit Tab and type in the word multiply, and we can see we've got this multiply double linear. So I'm going to go ahead and plug finger spread into that, select input 1, and if I double click on this, you'll see in the attribute editor that that input is taken up. And so we're going to multiply this by -1. So I'm going to type -1 into input 2. And then we're going to, again, plug that into rotate Y. And I will get another unit conversion. And there we go. And those unit conversions are a little tricky. They do tend to mess up your layout. Okay, so that's great. So now what do we have? Well, we've got finger spread. That's pretty good. So the ones in the middle, we just need to multiply by half. So let's go ahead and do that as well. So I'm going to go into my node editor. And again, we're going to add in a multiply, double linear. In fact, I'm going to have 2 of these. So I'm going to select that one, Control-C, Control-V to paste it. And so let's go ahead and plug in finger spread into the first one of these. Input 1, double click on it. So this is going to be for the ring finger. So it goes index, mid, ring. So middle finger is going to go negative, but it's going to go -0.5. So it's going to go half of that. So I'm going to double click on that. So go -0.5. And then plug that into rotate Y, adds in the unit conversion. Let's minimize that. And then let's do the last one. So we've got, again, finger spread going into multiply double linear, input 1. And the last one was -0.5. This is 0.5. And that is for our ring finger. So again, rotate Y, plug it in, we get our unit conversion, minimize, and that should work. So now, finger spread, there we go. So the middle fingers are spreading at half the rate of the outer fingers, and everything looks pretty good. So now we've got our hands rigged, and we can obviously do the exact same process on the other side. When your rig is done, you can now skin the character to the rig. Now, before we actually do that, we want to go through and clean up the rig, make sure everything is in its proper place before we apply the skin modifier. So if we go into the outliner, you'll see I've organized this character in a couple of different groups. I have this control main, and all the controls on the character are also added to this layer. So if I toggle controls on or off, they go with it. Now I have another layer called a utility layer and a corresponding group in the outliner. And these are basically the things that aren't skeletal joints and they're not controls. So it's all the other little helper objects that are used in the rig. So for example, the FK and IK joint chains, and then the proximity pins as well. Now we have a separate group for the geometry. And in this group, I've subgrouped the eyes and brows because we're really not going to be working with those when we skin the character. Those are actually going to be attached to the facial rig, which we're not going to be doing in this course. So I'm just going to keep those a little bit separately. And then finally, the skeleton. And this is all the skeletal joints in the character. If I turn off the geometry, you can see that that's what the skeleton is. Now, once you have things organized, you will need to also go through and make sure that your skeleton is properly placed. So for this, I like to use X-ray joints, and I just go through and I make sure that the fingers are all aligned properly, and basically everything is in the right place. Now, when you rig a character, there's a great chance that you may nudge something accidentally, and all of a sudden your skeleton does not line up with your character. So go through the entire rig, make sure all of that is in place as well. So go ahead and organize your rig and make sure that the skeleton still fits the character. And once you do that, you can begin skinning. It's now time to attach the geometry of the character to your rig using skinning. Now, skinning works on the skeletal joints. So if we go into our outliner, you'll see under skeleton, these are all the joints that will be used for skinning, and we will be skinning geometry. Now, the geometry comes in a couple of pieces for this character. We have the main body, we have the head, the hair, and then the eyes and brows. Now, I'm not going to skin or rig the eyes and brows for this particular character. We're doing that in another course. So I'm just going to go ahead and select those and hit Control H to hide them. So this is everything that needs to be skinned. So the skinning process is pretty simple. You select the joints that you want to skin, then the geometry, and then you do a bind skin. So in this case, let's start with this body. So I'm going to start by selecting everything but the head and neck. So I have this skeleton neck base. That is not going to touch my geometry for my body. So let's go ahead and select everything but that. And then shift select the body. The body is selected last, so it should highlight in green. And then do skin, bind skin. Now let's take a look at these options before we do this. I'm just going to use the defaults, which are these, but let's explain some of these. So the first one is bind to joint hierarchy. That means I can select the base of the spine and it will walk its way up and select every spine joint. If I wanted to, I could do selected joints, but then it won't get the hierarchies. I literally need to select every single joint. And that can be great if you're fine tuning, but for this case, joint hierarchy works. And then we're going to bind the vertex to the closest joint. We could do other options such as closest in hierarchy. And then skinning, we're going to stick with classic linear. Now, if you go down here to max influences, that can be shifted. If you have a very simple character, you might want to shift it down to, say, 3, maybe 4. And that just depends on how many bones per vertex are going to be skinned. So this particular character, I've got a lot of bones around the torso, so I'm not sure if I knock it down to 3 or 4 if it's going to get every single one of them. So for example, here you want to share influences with this one, and that one, and that's already 4 joints. So I'm going to keep this at 5 influences. And so basically I've got it at the default. So let's go ahead and bind skin, and there we go. Now let's go ahead and select the skeleton neck base, shift select the head, do another bind skin, select the hair, bind skin. So now I should have a character whose skin is bound. So let's go ahead and move them around. Yeah, it looks pretty good. I've got some utility nodes showing up there. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn off visibility for the utility nodes. And I'm also going to turn off visibility for the skeleton so we can see the deformation a little bit better. Now, once you have your skin bound to your character, you will need to test it out and do some fine tuning. So I find the easiest way to do that is to do a simple animation where your character kind of runs through some typical joint movements and then use that as kind of the guide for tweaking. So I'm going to go, let's say to frame 10, and let's select Control Body. Let's go ahead and set some keys for it. That's the hotkey S. So we can go key, set key. I'm going to move forward in my timeline to 20, drop them down, set some more keys, move him back, zero these out, and then set some more keys. So now he's squatted down. Let's go ahead and select the left foot. Again, set some keys here. I'm just doing every 10 frames, so let's go ahead and move that up and out, set some keys there, and then again, zero this out. So now we've got that. Let's go ahead and do the arm. So I'm going to select that bicep control, set some keys. Let's say rotate the arm down, set some more keys. Make sure that's at 0. Go ahead and set those keys. And then 0 everything out and set keys. So now I've got his arm, and let's go ahead and do one more for the fingers because that's a real tricky area. So I'm going to set some keys for curl and spread. Let's go ahead and start with spread. That's the big test. And actually, his fingers are spreading pretty nicely. And let's go ahead and curl the fingers, unspread them, and set keys for that, and then 0 that out. So now I've got this basic animation. So now my character is skinned, and I've got this test animation. So with this test animation in place, we can now start to tweak our skinning. Now let's refine our skin weights. We're going to start off with paint weights, and that's kind of a broad way to adjust weights. And typically what we do is we start with big areas of the character and get that skinning, and then we go down to the individual vertex. So we're going to start broad with paint weights. So I've added a little bit of animation to this character. I've done some stuff on the spine here. So when I rotate my spine around frame 129, 130, you can see I'm getting kind of this stair step effect in the weighting. And so we can fix a lot of that with paint weights. So I'm going to select the geometry of my character, go into my rigging menu set, and under skin, paint weights, and then open up the tool options. So this gives me a list of all the joints in the character. And then I need to understand what joints are affecting what weights. So if I go down to spine here, I've got rib left, right, and center. But this is rib left O3, but we can also do O2. And you can see that you kind of want those to overlap a little bit more. So this is a brush-based interface. It will work with tablets and all of that. So it's very similar to all the other tools that use the brush interface. So if you hold down the letter B, that resizes your brush. We can change the opacity of that brush, and we can change the value being painted. So I'm going to put this value, say at around 0.3 or so. Keep the opacity to around 0.5. And then let's go ahead and start painting. So what I do is I select a joint, in this case left O2, and that's the influence for that joint. So I'm going to adjust the size of my brush by holding down B, and then I'm just going to paint kind of around the edges here, and we're just going to add a little bit more influence to this joint. And then I'm going to go, say, up to rib left O3, and again, do the same. So what I'm trying to do is just kind of smooth this out. Now, if I want to, I can also do a smoothing operation, which might be better. So this is very similar to, say, sculpting. If you've ever done sculpting in my similar interface as well, we can smooth things. So I can say go up to my rib left O4. So what I'm doing here is I'm just tweaking the weighting. So instead of smooth, I'm going to go ahead and add. And so you can see that as I add in weights, it starts to move a little bit more towards that. So we can drop the value down just a little bit more. And so what I'm trying to do here is just get a nice smooth deformation. So I'm just working my way through each of these joints and making sure this is smooth. And so what I need to do is basically work my way all the way around the character, particularly in this torso. And so now we can see how the torso is moving, and you can see it's a little bit smoother. So Paint weights is a great way to work with large areas of the character. And you're going to go through your character, make sure all your weights are balanced and your character deforms smoothly. Painting skin weights can solve a lot of problems, but not all of them. So there are times when you'll need to go down to the individual vertex level to fine tune your skinning. And we're going to do that here on the character's feet. So if you can see, went right around here around frame 30 or 40, you can see that these vertices here are stretching. And that's because the bones in this foot are affecting the vertices in that foot. So we can do this on a vertex by vertex level. So I want to select the geometry, right click, go into vertex mode. Let's go ahead and select some of these vertices, and we can go into a window called the component editor. So if I go general editors, component editor, you'll see that it has a number of tabs. So springs, particles, and the one we're looking for is smooth skins. And this basically tells you which joint affects which vertex. So if I select one vertex, you can see that this is connected to the ankle left and right, the ball of the foot left and right, as well as the toe left and right. So what we want to do is basically just get rid of all the right influences. So skeleton ankle, make that 0. Skeleton ball of foot, make that 0. So now this particular vertex is only affected by the left side. So we can do that for a bunch of vertices at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and select some vertices here and then just use my greater than sign to basically go out to the entire foot. And you'll see we've got a lot of vertices and a lot of bones affecting it. So all we have to do is basically just go through all of the right side and zero it out. So I'm going to go skeleton ankle right, select the top one, go all the way to the bottom, shift select the bottom one. That selects everything in the column, and then just touch 0, enter, and you'll see that that kind of already has had a pretty good effect. So let's go ahead to the ball of the foot. Again, I'm shift selecting all of these and zeroing them out. The heel is another one. The knee, I'm surprised that the knee is affecting this one, but there we go. And one more for the toe. It's a great way to eliminate things wholeheartedly, but we can also go down on the individual vertex level and understand how every single joint affects each individual vertex. And this is a great way for truly fine-tuning joint weights and understanding exactly how vertices are affected by joints. So you can go through this very, very precisely and truly fine-tune your skinning. Fine-tuning your character's skin weights can be a very time-consuming process. So, in order to save time, you can mirror the weights from one side of your character to the other. So here I have my character, and at this point he's pretty close. And one of the things you can see is that this left foot is fixed, but the right foot is still kind of broken. So the weighting is not correct on that foot. Now we can fix this just by mirroring the weights. So it's a very simple process. All you do is select the geometry, go into skin, mirror skin weights. So what are we mirroring? We're going to mirror across the vertical axis, Y, Z. So this. So the character is vertical in Y and facing Z. So X is kind of our left-right axis. So we want Y, Z. Positive to negative. So positive X is on the right, negative X is on the left. Yes, we want to go from this side because this is where we fix the weighting to the other. And then surface association. And what that means is how is it going to figure out what vertex on this side matches that vertex on the other side? And basically, we're just going to use the closest point on the surface. And then use the other defaults as well. So let's just go ahead and click mirror. Now, That foot works. So now I've mirrored my character from one side to the other, and hopefully the weights should work. Now you can continue to tweak your weighting, and I like to basically work on the left side and then mirror over to the right, but you still will need to check to make sure that both sides of the character are deforming properly. And once you do that, your character is done. Well, that just about does it for this course. Hopefully, you understand a little bit more about how to rig a character's body. And if you want to dive further into Maya character rigging, we have a number of other courses that cover a wide variety of topics. So until next time, I'm George Maestri for LinkedIn Learning.